There were 40 reporters packed shoulder to shoulder at the front entrance that night. Cameras up, microphones ready. All of them waiting to catch the famous owner stepping out of a black car onto the red carpet. They waited for 2 hours. He never came through the front. Because while the cameras pointed at the door, the most recognizable man in the building had already slipped in through the alley, past the dumpsters, through the steam and the noise of the kitchen, where he tied on a stained apron and started washing dishes next to a nervous 19-year-old, who had absolutely no idea he was standing beside the man who owned everything he could see. Stay with me to the end of this one, because what that young dishwasher did over the next 2 hours, and the reason the owner came in through the kitchen in the first place, is one of the most quietly beautiful things I've ever come across. The restaurant was called Vance & Co., and that night it was the center of the city's attention. It was the flagship, the first and the finest of a small group of restaurants that had grown, over 15 years, into something close to legendary. And the man whose name was on the door was Julian Vance. If you don't recognize the name, picture the kind of actor whose face you've known your whole life. 3 decades of films. The sort of star who could fill a theater just by showing up. Years ago, at the height of his fame, Julian had done something most people in his position never do. He'd opened a restaurant, not as a vanity project, but because cooking was the thing he'd loved before the cameras ever found him. And against all odds, it had worked. The restaurants became as celebrated as his films. That particular night, Vance & Co. was hosting a gala, a 10th anniversary celebration, with a charity attached, the proceeds going to a foundation that trained young people from hard backgrounds for careers in kitchens. Half the city's notable faces were on the guest list, which is why, by 7 o'clock, there were 40 reporters and a wall of cameras stacked up at the front entrance. All of them waiting for one shot, Julian Vance, stepping out of a car, onto the carpet, into the light. What none of them knew was that Julian Vance had not the slightest intention of walking that carpet. He never did. In 15 years of owning restaurants, Julian Vance had almost never once entered one of them through the front door. He always came in through the kitchen. To understand why, you have to know where Julian Vance started, and almost nobody who saw him on a movie screen ever did. Before the films, before any of it, Julian had been a 16-year-old kid with a rough home life and nowhere to be, who'd talked his way into a dishwashing job at a diner because it came with a free meal at the end of a shift. He'd spent 2 years with his hands in scalding water, scrubbing pots, mopping floors, getting yelled at by line cooks. And he'd loved it. Not the scrubbing, the kitchen. The heat and the chaos, and the strange, fierce family that forms in the back of a restaurant during a rush. The dignity of feeding people. That diner kitchen had been the first place in his life Julian Vance ever felt like he belonged. It was where someone first handed him a knife and showed him how to use it. It was where he learned that the most important people in any restaurant are not the ones the guests ever see. He never forgot it. And when fame came, and money came, and the world started treating him like he was something more than a kid who used to wash dishes, Julian made himself a quiet rule. He would always come in through the back. He would always tie on an apron before he ever sat at a table. Because the day he started entering his own kitchens like a king instead of a dishwasher was the day he'd have become the kind of man he'd spent his whole life trying not to be. So that night, while 40 cameras watched the front door, Julian Vance's car dropped him a block away. He walked down the alley in a plain jacket, let himself in through the kitchen entrance the way the staff did, and stepped into the roar of the busiest night of the year. And in the chaos, nobody looked twice at him. The kitchen of Vance & Co. during a gala was a controlled hurricane. 20 cooks, a wall of fire and steam, tickets pouring in faster than anyone could read them, the expediters shouting, pans clattering, the whole beautiful violent machinery of a great restaurant at full tilt. In the middle of all that, in the corner by the great steel sinks, was the dish pit, the lowest, hottest, most thankless station in any kitchen. And working it, alone, drowning, was a kid named Mateo. Mateo was 19 years old and 1 week into the job. He'd come up through exactly the kind of program the night's gala was raising money for. A kid from a hard part of town who'd never had a real shot at anything until someone gave him a chance in a kitchen. He needed this job more than he'd ever needed anything. He was sending half of every paycheck home to his mother and his little sister. And on the biggest night of the year, the other dishwasher who was supposed to be working beside him had simply not shown up, and Mateo was buried. Plates and pots and pans stacking up faster than 2 hands could possibly move them, the cooks already starting to bark about clean pans. The panic rising in his chest because he just knew, that drowning on a night like this could be the thing that cost him everything. That was when an older man in a plain jacket appeared beside him, rolled up his sleeves, grabbed an apron off the hook, tied it on, and said, "Looks like you could use a hand. Where do you want me?" Mateo barely glanced at him. He assumed the guy was a new hire, or a temp the chef had pulled in for the rush. They did that on big nights. He had no time to wonder. Yes, please," he stammered. "You can, the pans. Can you start scrubbing the pans? They're killing me on pans." "On it," the man said, and he stepped up to the sink and went to work. And here's the thing that Mateo noticed in the first 30 seconds, even buried as he was. The older guy was fast. He wasn't fumbling around like a temp who'd never seen a dish pit. He scrubbed like he'd been doing it his whole life, efficient, unbothered by the heat, stacking the clean pans in exactly the right place without being told. Within a few minutes, the wall of dirty pans had stopped growing. Within 10, it was actually shrinking. The two of them fell into a rhythm without a word, the way people do in a kitchen when the work is good, and for the first time all night, Mateo felt his head come up above water. "You've done this before," Mateo said, grinning a little, breathless. "Long time ago," the man said. "You don't forget." What happened over the next 2 hours is the heart of this story, and it's not the part you might expect. Because here's what Mateo did. He could have just let the new guy grind away in silence and been grateful for the help. Instead, in the middle of the worst rush of his young life, Mateo took care of him. When the man flinched a little reaching into the hot water, Mateo tossed him the good gloves, the ones he kept for himself, and said, "Here, use these. Your hands'll thank you." When the expediters screamed something incomprehensible across the kitchen, Mateo translated it for the older man so he wouldn't get chewed out for not knowing the lingo. And about an hour in, when there was a 30-second lull, Mateo reached into his bag, pulled out half of the sandwich he'd brought from home, the only food he'd brought for a 12-hour shift, and held it out. "You eaten?" Mateo asked. "Here, take half. You can't work a night like this on empty, man, trust me." The older man looked at the half a sandwich, at this kid who clearly didn't have much, who was sending money home, who was drowning himself, offering up half of the little he had to a total stranger he assumed was just another broke worker like him, and Julian Vance, who owned the building they were standing in, and 4 others like it, who could have bought every sandwich in the city, took the half a sandwich from the 19-year-old dishwasher and said, very quietly, "Thank you. That's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a long time." He meant it more than Mateo could possibly have known. They worked side by side for 2 hours, and in between the chaos, In the snatched moments between waves, they talked the way you do in a dish pit. Mateo told the man about his mom, about his little sister, about the program that had given him this shot, about how scared he was of losing it, and how he prayed every night he was good enough to keep it. He talked about the owner, too, this Julian Vance guy he'd never met. Everybody says he's the real deal, Mateo said, scrubbing. Says he actually cares about people like us. The whole back of the house. I don't know. I never met him. Big shot like that, why would he even know my name? He laughed a little, not bitterly, just the laugh of a kid who'd learned not to expect too much. But I hope it's true. Be nice to work for somebody like that. The older man scrubbed quietly for a moment. I think it's probably true, he said. It was almost 9 o'clock when the head chef came back into the kitchen looking for the owner. The chef, a sharp woman named Dana who'd run Julian's flagship for years, had been told the boss had arrived but couldn't find him anywhere on the floor. She finally pushed through into the kitchen and stopped dead. Because there, in the corner, in a stained apron up to his elbows in dishwater next to the new kid, was Julian Vance. Chef, Julian said, looking up with a grin, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Your dish pit was short tonight. You should fix that. Donna's mouth fell open. And Mateo turned to look at the older man beside him, the one whose hands he'd given his good gloves to, the one he'd shared his sandwich with, the one he'd told all about how he hoped the famous owner was a decent guy, and watched the chef of the entire restaurant say the word that made the floor drop out from under him. Mr. Vance, Donna said. We've been looking everywhere for you. Mr. Vance, Mateo's stomach turned to ice. Every word he'd said came rushing back. He'd put the owner, on pan duty. He'd bossed him around. He'd given him the leftover gloves and told him the lingo and handed him half a sandwich and asked him, to his face, whether the famous Julian Vance was actually a decent guy or not. Oh no, Mateo breathed. Oh no, sir, I had no idea, I'm so sorry, And Julian Vance turned to him, dried his hands on the apron, and said the thing I told you about at the very beginning, the thing that stayed with me ever since I heard it. Don't you dare apologize, Julian said gently. Do you have any idea what you just did? He shook his head, and there was something shining in his eyes. You didn't know who I was. I was just some older guy who showed up in your dish pit looking lost on the worst night of the year. You could have ignored me. You could have let me sink. Instead, you gave me your gloves so my hands wouldn't burn. You translated for me so I wouldn't get yelled at. And when you've got almost nothing, when you're sending your money home and you brought one sandwich to last a 12-hour shift, you gave me half of it. His voice caught. Son, I have spent 15 years coming in through the kitchen of every restaurant I own, specifically so I can find out how the people back here treat someone they think can do nothing for them. I've seen a lot of kitchens. I have never, not once, been treated as well by a stranger as you just treated me tonight. Mateo couldn't speak. You asked me if Julian Vance was a decent guy, Julian went on, with a small, wrecked smile. I'll tell you what I told you before. I think it's probably true. But I'll tell you something I know for certain. The kid washing dishes next to me tonight is the best thing in this entire building, and there are some very fancy people out front. He put a hand on Mateo's shoulder, including, apparently, 40 reporters who are still standing at my front door waiting for me to show up. What Julian did for Mateo after that, he did the way the best things are done, without a show. There was no announcement at the gala, no spotlight. No kid paraded out for the cameras as a feel-good story. That would have been about Julian, and Julian had spent his whole life making sure it was never about Julian. Instead, in the weeks that followed, Mateo was quietly moved off the dish pit and into a real cook's training track, the kind the Knight's whole charity existed to fund, with Julian's personal mentorship attached, though Mateo was sworn to keep that part quiet. His mother got a letter telling her that her son had a future. And a standing rule went up in that kitchen, in Julian's own handwriting, where only the staff could see it. The most important person in this restaurant is whoever the guests will never meet. Treat the stranger in the dish pit like he owns the place. One day, he might. But the thing that changed Mateo wasn't the promotion. It was something Julian said to him before he finally went out to face his gala. The words he left him with. "I came up the exact same way you did," Julian told him. 16 years old, no money, no people, washing dishes for a free meal. Everything I have started in a dish pit just like this one. So don't you ever let anybody, including yourself, tell you that the dishwasher doesn't matter. The dishwasher is where I came from. And on a good night, the dishwasher is the best man in the building. And then Julian Vance tied his apron back on, picked up a pan, and finished the rush at Mateo's side before he ever set foot on the floor. While 40 reporters waited at a front door he was never going to walk through. I think about this story more than I expected to. And not because a famous man washed some dishes, though he did. The part that stays with me is what it says about where we point the cameras. Because that night, 40 reporters stood at the front entrance, lenses up, certain that the important thing, the only thing worth capturing, was going to come walking through that grand front door in a tailored coat. And the whole time, the most important thing in the entire building was happening in the back, by a steel sink, in the steam, where no camera was ever going to point. A 19-year-old kid with nothing was quietly being the best person in the room, and he was doing it for a stranger he thought could never repay him, which is the only reason it counted. That's the thing, isn't it? We're all standing at the front door with our cameras up, waiting for greatness to arrive looking like greatness. And it almost never does. It shows up in the dish pit. It shows up as a kid sharing half a sandwich. It shows up as the people we've decided not to watch, doing the quiet, decent, invisible things that no one is ever supposed to see. The real story is almost never at the front entrance. It's slipping in through the kitchen. So here's what I'll ask you. Sometime soon, you're going to be tempted to point your attention at the front door, at the important person, the impressive one, the one everyone's watching. And somewhere off to the side, unwatched, someone with far less than you will quietly do something kind for someone who can't pay them back. Don't miss it. That's the part worth watching. That's the part that's real. If this story moved you, leave one word in the comments, Apron, just so I know you made it to the end, and so I know there are still people out there who'd hand a stranger their good gloves and half their sandwich. And if you believe the best people are usually the ones in the back of the room that nobody's filming, then subscribe, because those are the only people we make stories about on this channel. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.